Hello guys, I have a single question to try and answer for you today, which is how good is Devastation Evoker? We have been through all of the melee DPS specs, all the range DPS specs, and I have finally got around to having a look at Devastation Evoker. I've played with a bunch whenever I've done any Mythic Plus testing, and they've done decently well. They overall seem to be performing okay. They're not the best, they're not the worst. I would say they're middle-ish, top of the middle of the pack. They have just had some updates with yesterday's patch, and that has helped a lot. So they've increased pyre damage, which previously you were essentially using your single target spender in AoE because pyre was so weak. So that's a massive change, which has really helped. I'm still not sure if it's going to push it into the top of the meta, just because of the way that the spec works. So we'll get onto that, why I think that, and we'll go through everything. The way that I actually want to review Evoker is because everything else that we've done, we've compared to the previous version of itself. So we've compared it to Shadowlands, we've described how it's changing, what's good and what's bad about the changes. We can't really do that with Evoker, right? All that I can do is I can compare it to something else. So I'm going to be comparing Evoker to probably the most stable Mythic Plus ranged DPS spec in the game, which is Fire Mage. So Fire Mage has been a staple in the meta. It's always performed particularly well, usually A+, all the way through Legion, BFA, and Shadowlands. It's been in the Mythic Plus meta, and it's been part of those conversations. So I feel like it's a great place to try and compare Evoker to. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to compare utility and tankiness. So for those of you that haven't really watched any of my other videos before, there are 3 pillars that I try and assess a spec on. The 3 consist of tankiness, so how tanky is the spec, how much utility does the spec bring to a group, and then damage, so what's its damage profile, how much damage is it doing. That's obviously probably the biggest question that goes unanswered right now because they're still tuning, and that's up in the air. It's also probably the biggest factor as to why something is successful. But I'll use an example, which is Outlaw Rogue. Season 4 of Shadowlands, it wasn't doing the most damage, right? It was doing decent damage, but because of its tankiness, because of its utility, it was still getting brought to groups, and it was at least A+, if not S tier for Shadowlands Season 4. So that's a good example of where classes, because they're strong outside of just damage, they're still getting brought to these conversations, and they're still becoming part of the meta. So utility and tankiness might not be the most important, but they are still absolutely important, and that's what I'm going to try and assess first by comparing a Fire Mage. I'll then run through the abilities that you have, so almost like a mini gameplay review, and we'll have a look at how much damage it's actually doing when I try and do an AoE opener. So let's start off by doing the comparison. So in terms of tankiness and comparing to Fire Mage has a barrier which is 25 seconds, 25% HP shield. Devastation Evoker has Rescue, which is a 60 seconds cooldown, 30% HP shield. That's clearly worse than Fire Mage. It's roughly 50% worse, right? If we just say that if this was 30% and 30 seconds, then it's twice the cooldown essentially for Devastation Evoker. So that's absolutely a direct comparison. Devastation Evoker is worse. Mirror images. Fire Mage has a 20% DR on a 90-second cooldown. Devastation Evoker has Obsidian Scales, which is a 30% DR on a 90-second cooldown, but it also can have 2 charges. That is significantly better. I would say it's more than twice as good. In my mind, the 2 charges means that you're probably going to be able to get 3 of these out, if not 4, on every single boss fight, because you can immediately get one on cooldown. You then wait another 30 seconds, press another, and then you've got a minute and a half till the next one, so you just cover it with Rescue, and then it's coming up again, and then the next one's coming up 30 seconds after that. So you could probably get 4 off in a 3.5 minute fight, something like that. Whereas a 3.5 minute fight, you're only going to get 2 or 3 off for mirror images, and it's a higher DR, so I would say that's probably about twice as good as mirror images. So although you don't have as much in terms of HP shields, you have better DRs. Mage then has Alter Time, which is a full heal every 50 seconds. Obviously in practice that's not the case, but that's the limit of it. Same with Renewing Blades for Devastation Evoker, it's a full heal but every single 90 seconds. So again, this is a nerf over Alter Time for Devastation Evoker. It's obviously worse than Alter Time. Fire Mage then has 2 cooldowns which Devastation Evoker does not even get access to. So the first is Ice Block, which is an immunity, 5-minute cooldown, right, and then a cheat death in terms of Cauterize. There's nothing in comparison in the Devastation Evoker kit, and those two things just make Fire Mage incredibly tanky, so not getting access to that is obviously a huge loss again. It does, however, have Zephyr, so Zephyr is a 20% DR on a 2-minute cooldown, which also applies to your entire group. So another thing to mention is Rescue. You can also apply the 30% HP shield to a group member. So a common theme here is that Fire Mage is incredibly tanky, but it's very selfish in its tankiness, right? This is all for itself. Devastation Evoker is different in that it's not as tanky as Fire Mage, however, it is bringing extra utility to the group and tankiness to the group. So I think it's worse than Fire Mage in terms of tankiness. It's not that much worse, it's probably just in the group below Fire Mage. However, because it brings this extra group-wide tankiness and group-wide utility, it's still going to be part of the conversation as to bring to a group because of its tankiness. Yeah. Looking into utility then, I'm going to go through this really quickly. We have Lust. Both classes have Lust, right? Fire Mage has Arcane Intellect. This is very strong. Specifically, if you have other spellcasters in your group, it's always going to affect the healer, right? Devastation Evoker has the Bronze buff, so that's a cooldown reduction on movement abilities. That's not as good in my mind, but we'll leave it there as a direct comparison. Fire Mage has Kick. Evoker has Kick. They're on similar cooldowns. Fire Mage has Blast Wave and Dragon's Breath, 2 relatively short cooldowns, and Devastation Evoker has Tail Swipe and Wing Buffet, as well as Deep Breath, so it has 3 AoE stops. One of these can be reduced to 45 seconds as well. So if we have a 1.5 minute, a 45 second, and a 1 minute, they're going to be relatively comparable. Say if you make Tail Swipe a 45 second AoE knockup, that's similar to Dragon's Breath, really, isn't it? And then you have 2 AoE stops on a 1.5 minute and a 1 minute over Blast Wave, which is on 30 seconds. So because you can have 2 cooldowns, 1 on 1.5, 1 on 1 minute, I think again it's relatively comparable in terms of the stops that it brings. For roots and slows, etc., Fire Mage brings Ring of Frost and Frost Nova. It then has Ice Nova as well, which I actually haven't put in here, but it has 2 ways of providing these sort of slows and stops in movement for tanks of like kiting. Devastation Evoker only has 1 ability, which is Landslide on a 1.5 minute CD, so again it's slightly behind, but these aren't really the reasons why you're bringing classes to groups, right? It's just a nice to have. Fire Mage then has a Dispel in terms of spell steal, right? So a purge effect. Evoker doesn't get access to that, but it has a Pressing Roar. Now, Pressing Roar is incredibly niche because A, it's increasing the duration of CCs, but B, it's an AoE Soothe, which no other class gets. So this is very, very strong, and I would say massively outweighs Purge. Purge most classes can get. I say most classes, it's probably about half the classes, but no one really gets access to an AoE Soothe, and Soothes are much harder to come by in the first place, so this is very, very strong. And on weeks like Enraging, this is going to be very, very strong. Mage then has a D-Curse, Evoker has a Poison Dispel. Evoker then additionally gets a Dispel on I think it's a 1 minute cooldown, Cauterizing Flame, which can remove pretty much any debuff from the game, including bleeds. Again, that's very, very niche. Dwarves have this as a racial, but Evoker is now getting this and can apply it to anyone. Again, very, very strong as like a group utility that you can bring. It has the Fly to Me buff, which is the 30% HP shield on your rescue target, and then Zephyr as well, which is a 20% DR group wide. This is also movement speed. So overall, I would actually say that Evoker has more utility than Fire Mage. It is probably one of the longest lists and most impactful lists of any spec in the game in terms of utility that it's bringing to a Mythic Plus group. It's not as tanky, but it brings more utility. Honestly, I think I would prefer to be tanky. I want to have tankiness, and I then want to bring stops. If I'm playing Mythic Plus, especially in the Pug world where I'm just trying to control mobs, I think those are the two things that I want. And to be honest with you, Fire Mage is tankier, and then it brings just as many AoE stops. So in that world, it's definitely better to be a Fire Mage. However, what I will say is Evoker has all of these little tools that I think really bring it on equal footing to Mage in terms of tankiness and utility. I really do think that having Zephyr, having Rescue to be able to help your group out, having things like Cauterizing Flame, having your AoE Soothe, having your CC duration increase, right? All of this stuff I really do think makes the Evoker similar, I would have said, to Fire Mage, so it's in a very good spot in terms of its tankiness and utility. Let's have a look at its damage then and how it actually plays. So for those of you that haven't tried this yourself, Devastation Evoker, Evoker when you first make the spec has a little warning that says that it's for like professional gamers only. I'm paraphrasing there, I'm making that up, but it's something like that, where you have to put in a little statement that says like Evoker or something in to make sure that you actually want to create a character, because it's so complicated and such a hard spec to play. That's just not true whatsoever. This is probably one of the easiest specs that I've played. You essentially have 6 abilities to keep track of in your DPS rotation, right? It's very, very simple. You can see my bars are pretty fleshed out here, but all of this is utility, movement, defensives, healing, right? Actual damage buttons, there's literally these 4 here. So we have essentially the way that the spec works is it's a spender, a bit like Death Knight, where you have a rune system, they call it essences, that then you deplete those essences to spend, right? And then in between you have fillers. Those fillers can proc essence regeneration essentially, or free abilities, free spenders. So you have spenders and fillers, and you're essentially waiting on a recharge system, and you can speed up that recharge system with your fillers. So it's very, very simple, right? There's not much to keep track of. You just have essences to keep track of. You're not really keeping track of many procs. The only procs that you're really keeping track of is when you use a filler, sometimes you can make your next spender free. So let's quickly go through the fillers then. Fillers, you have Living Flame, which is essentially just a 2.3 second, I think it's 2.5 second cast that's then hasted. It's just a single target nuke, right? Single target filler. You then have Azure Strike, which is an AoE filler. It just hits 3 enemies. Yeah. We then have our spenders. So we have an AoE spender. So for some reason, I don't know why they've done this, but your red spells are single target in terms of filler, but then AoE in terms of spender, right? So we have Pyre here. You essentially just lob a fireball at the target, and then it does damage. It hits everything around it. It's uncapped. Yeah. We then have a single target spender, which is just a single target nuke that is channeled over 2.5 seconds. So let's just quickly show you how this works then. So the single target filler, just a simple cast, then hits a single target. We then have Azure Strike, which is our AoE filler, right? So Azure Strike is just an instant cast that does damage to 3 targets. We then have our AoE Spender, which is Pyre. Again, it's targeted. It then just does AoE damage around the target, right? And then we have our single target Spender, which is just a channel on a single target. There's no real interaction between any of this. It's just fillers and spenders, and like I said, sometimes you can proc by trying to do it here. I'll show you. Here we go. So I've just procced it. You have essence burst. This just makes your next spender free, so you don't spend essence. That's the only interaction. Otherwise it's just spend and fill. Very, very simple. We then have what I think Blizzard meant by the classes hard to play. We have these things called empowered abilities, which are new to the game. I hate them. They're very, very clunky, but there's no real difference between them and essentially a button that has a cast time. So it's a cast time that you can cancel early to then do different effects. So we have 2 of these empowered abilities, and this is, like I said, what I think Blizzard are classing as the new of the spec, right? So we have Fire Breath. Basically, you hold it down to empower it, and it does its damage over a shorter duration. So it's a 3.3 second channel. And if you hold it for the entire duration, it does its damage over a much shorter duration. It means almost nothing to empower this. And I don't think there's any time that I would empower this other than that if I think that some ads are going to die quickly. It's going to be useful in Raid. It's going to be useful when there's like small ads in Mythic Plus. But essentially, it's just AoE damage on an empowered ability that does reduced damage beyond 5 targets. So if I just show you quickly, if I empower this to its full potential, it'll do upfront damage, and then it's got a short dot that drops off. So it's done all of its damage over, including the channel time, about 10 seconds there, right? If I just let this go to its first empower, it's going to do exactly the same damage. So it did 323k here. It's going to do roughly the same damage. Obviously, some of it can crit, but it's going to do roughly the same damage just over a much longer duration. So if I just press it once, let it go off immediately, it should be roughly 300k damage again. And like I said, there's no difference. It doesn't feel like you should empower it at all, really. I don't know when I would empower it. I think the only time that I would empower it, like I said, is if I think ads are going to die fairly quick, because otherwise I see no reason to. It's just not worth it. Oh, because of I've dropped out of combat, you're not going to be able to see. But trust me, it does exactly the same damage. So 240k plus 85 there, 320, and what was the previous one? 320, yeah. So it's exactly the same damage, it's just over a shorter duration. I have no idea why you would ever empower it. In practical applications, I think you're just going to let it go to the first stage every time. And then the single target empowered ability is Eternity Surge. And again, if you're in a single target situation, you literally won't empower this, which just feels really weird that your two empowered abilities are essentially just normal abilities. The only time that you're going to empower this is in AoE, which obviously is a fair amount of time in Mythic Plus, but for Raiden, not particularly. So if I just empower Eternity Surge to the 5th stage here, or 4th stage, sorry, it would then hit 8 targets, so it just increases the target count. If I just channel it to the first level, it will hit 1 additional target, so it will only hit 2 targets. There's no real difference. But that's it. That is essentially your entire rotation. It's incredibly simple. You even have the ability to cast on the move most of the time with hover. I really feel like this is almost as good as BM Hunter in terms of, for new players, it's very simple. The damage that you're doing, you can probably get to like 90% of the way there with playing the spec for about an hour, I would have imagined. Once you get used to it, get used to your keybinds where these 6 abilities are, you don't really have to concentrate too much on procs. You're just spending your essence bursts. As long as you're spending your essence bursts wisely, I don't think there's too much to the rotation from what I can tell. It's very simple. It feels very strange that there's this disclaimer on it saying not for new players, you have to be a professional gamer to play this, and then you come and actually play it and it's got like 6 rotational abilities, of which when you're in AoE or single target you're probably going to be pressing 5 of them, right? Like there's not much there at all really to talk about. It's very simple. In terms of the actual damage it's doing then, right, let's just do a quick AoE opener. I'll show you the talents that I've taken here. Most of these talents are just like flat damage increases. There's nothing that really affects gameplay. There's a couple of nodes. So down here, Charged Blast. Your blue damage increases the damage of your next pyre by 5%, stacking 20 times. So that means when we're using Azure Strike as our filler, we're going to be increasing pyre damage, right? We have some interactions here, like Fire Breath damage has a chance to cause your next Living Flame to be instant casts, stacking 2 times. That's like negative interaction with empowering Fire Breath. If you could imagine, Fire Breath damage is you're getting more ticks from Fire Breath damage if you just do the level 1 empower. So in single target you'll do a level 1 empower and then you're going to get more chances at this. That's terribly designed in my mind. That makes no sense that this talent exists, but it does. So again, there's a little interaction here. Single target, you want to just level 1 empower Fire Breath, so then you get more instant cast Living Flames, right? There's some interaction down here. So Feed the Flames, consuming Essence Burst, reduces the remaining cooldown of Fire Breath by 2 seconds. So that means that you can get a shorter cooldown Fire Breath. There is also Casualty over here. So Essence abilities reduce the remaining cooldown of Eternity Surge by 1 second. So both of these get reduced by Essence Burst consumption, right? More Essence Bursts, the shorter cooldown these are going to be, and this is where a lot of your damage comes from. These then also have an interaction with Dragon Rage. So this is just your... Dragon Rage is essentially just your damage and cooldown, right? It means that you get a 100% chance to proc Essence Burst whenever you use a filling ability. So whenever you use Azure Strike or Living Flame, right? You then also get this interaction. So Animosity, casting an Empower spell extends the duration of Dragon Rage by 6 seconds. So each press of these gives you an extra 6 seconds in here. There's a bit of a min-maxing game where you press Dragon's Rage and then spending your fillers and spending your Essence Burst means that you can get a second rotation of these with inside your Dragon Rage cooldowns, right? So you can Dragon Rage, immediately Fire Breath, immediately Eternity Surge, and then you can get both of these off again within the Dragon Rage window, extending them further. So it's a small interaction there, but again, it's not particularly complicated, right? It's just Dragon's Rage and then get as many empowered abilities in as you can. Otherwise, honestly, most stuff is literally just... It's just like damage, right? There's not much in here that's changing the way that you play. At least with what I've chosen, like things like Firestorm, again, just doesn't do enough damage. This is almost like Mage, so Frost Mage not taking Blizzard or something is how I imagine this. I really think that this should just be buffed, so yeah, it's a must take. At the moment, it just doesn't feel like it's worth pressing to me. Like, especially inside cooldowns where you want to be spending as many Essence Bursts as possible to get that second round of empowered abilities into Dragon's Rage. Like, it's quite a tight window to be able to do it. Just feel like this should just be buffed so you actually want to take it and press it. Because it's a shame that you don't take it in AoE at the minute. And see, we've barely spent anything down at the bottom. Because you're inside cooldowns constantly and you have lots of Essence Bursts up, ordered power might be alright. I've tested it and I haven't really been able to tell that it's that impactful. The other things that casting a powered spell increases your essence regeneration by 100% for 2 seconds. It's just like flat essence and like flat damage again, right? Nothing that interesting down here, to be honest. It's all relatively samey, and like I said again, it just means that you're not spending all of your points down here because you don't really care too much, from what I can tell. I might have got this wrong, but I just don't feel like I care too much about it. So let's just show you the opener then, right? Essentially what I'm going to do is dump all of my essence. Now previously, because I just want to mention this again, because Pyre wasn't doing enough damage on 4 targets, you were spending your essence on single target spenders, right? So you were spending your essence on Disintegrate, even on 4 targets, even on 5 or 6 targets, I think you still were, because of this node here, Charged Blast. Now, Pyre has been increased by about 33%, I think, the damage that it's doing, so I think it's worth pressing. I think. On 4 targets. If it isn't, it's just wrong anyway. It needs to be buffed again, but I'm pretty sure this is now worth pressing on 4 targets, so I'm just going to be spamming Pyre, right? That's how I'm going to be doing it. So I'll spam Pyre to start off with, deplete all my essences. I'll then go into cooldown, so I'll Trinket. I'll use Deep Breath, which is just a 1-minute CD. It has no interaction with your kit. I'll then use Dragon Rage. We'll use our 2 empowered abilities, and we'll get into the rotation, where we are simply using fillers and spending. We'll start off then, let's just dump all of our essences. We use our Trinket, we use Deep Breath. We use Dragon Rage. I'm just going to use a Pyre immediately. I'll then use level 1 Dragon's Breath, Disintegrate. Why can't I see abilities? That's weird. Huh. I think I've just found a bug. Level 1 Deep Breath again. Into Eternity Surge. So you can see it's doing the damage, right? So that was roughly, I think I go into my CDs about 10 seconds after the start. So it's roughly 50 seconds like I do with everything else. It's sustaining around 95k, right? If you look at the damage that it's doing as well, this is just uncapped damage, right? Deep Breath is reduced beyond 5 targets. Eternity Surge is essentially up to 8 targets. Deep Breath again, uncapped. Azure Strike is 3 targets. Living Flame is single target, right? This is very similar to Fire Mage's damage profile, where almost all of your damage is uncapped or doing some slightly reduced damage. It's very, very AoE centric, and because of the damage profile and how much damage it's doing, I really do think it's going to be very good. I can't give it Fire Mage's sort of level quite yet. I think it's just beneath it. Do you know what I mean? It's just beneath it in terms of tankiness. It does bring more utility, but I do think Fire Mage is doing more damage overall from what I can tell from the keys that I've been in. There's a few range specs that are standing out to me, right? Mage is, Affliction Warlock is, Boomkin is, and I'd also say Evoker is. Like, those range specs are really jumping out. I mean, BM Hunter is also doing the damage, but I am still a little bit afraid about its tankiness. I think Mage is just ahead of everything else, and then all of these other range specs that are doing decently just slot in underneath. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're just slightly beneath. So you'll see that when we come up with our tier list. But it's in that group is basically what I'm trying to say. The damage that it's doing is excellent, and it is very uncapped. I'm just not quite sure if it's going to be the same level as Fire and Frost, right? Mages just seems to be a little bit ahead. With that being said, let's just quickly go over some downsides and upsides. I'm not going to call them wins and losses or anything, but there's a couple of downsides that I want to mention, and there's one big upside, which again, I've sort of talked around these, but not really covered them completely yet. The first downside is the range, right? It is just very, very hard to play around this 25-yard range, specifically in raiding. So if I just show you quickly, if I target a dummy, we walk back, we're now out of range. So with this halfway between ranged and melee, where range can sit at 40 or 45 yards, so they'll be like back here or like back here, depending on the class that they're playing, and then we're all the way forwards to here as an Evoker. I don't think it matters too much for Mythic Plus, right? But it really will matter for raiding if Evokers are marked as being ranged and they get targeted by ranged mechanics, but then they can't stand in the ranged groups which are further back here. I don't know whether you bring the ranged group forwards. I don't know whether you just send Evokers off to the sides. They aren't going to like get pools on the floor in the middle of the ranged and the melee packs. I have no idea how it's going to work, but it's bad. That's all I'll say. It feels like they're trying to do something novel. They're like, oh, we're going to make this new mid-range caster because it breathes fire, so it needs to be up close to its enemies. In theory, that's all well and good. However, not having at least a cooldown or something, which means that you can stand at further range, or essentially making it a melee caster where you sit in like 15-yard range, but you're essentially a melee class. Either of those really needs to be the option going forward, I think. I don't know if they would ever make the range just 40 yards, because then it feels like you're sort of breaking the law of the spec, right, where it's a dragon that wants to be up close and personal. So I don't know if that would happen, but it either needs to become a melee spec in terms of how it gets targeted with mechanics and raid, or it needs a cooldown which increases its range to 40 yards periodically. Is it called Rule of Law or something for Paladin? Holy Paladin? I can't remember, but Holy Paladin gets something similar. It needs to be one of those two options in my mind, because it's awful where it is currently. The next thing that I want to talk about, which is just another downside, is the Deep Breath anti-synergy. So I mentioned it a couple of times, but basically burnout here, if you use a max empowered Fire Breath, then it doesn't tick very often, the Fire Breath damage, which means you almost never get burnouts. But if you do a level 1 empowerment, you get more burnouts. That just is like anti-synergy, where you want to be using Fire Breath at the lowest empowerment. Eternity Surge is essentially the same in single target, where there's very little reason to go above 1 empowerment, right? So there's a bit of there's the way that empowerments work, even the way that they feel. So the way that they've been designed is you have to hold down the button. So if I just press Fire Breath once, it'll immediately go to the rank 1 empowerment. If I press and hold it, then I can go through to 4, and I can lift off whenever I want to cancel it and then do that stage. It feels really weird. It doesn't really feel like WoW, to be honest. It feels a bit like, I think WildStar might have had mechanics like this. I can't really remember, but there's definitely been other MMOs where they've explored with like charging up abilities. It just feels clunky. It feels nowhere near as smooth as the rest of the game. I think it'd be better if you just pressed it once. So say it was like Blizzard or Pyroblast or Flame Strike or something where it's a long cast and then you could press it again to cancel it early and only get part of the effect. I think that would make more sense for WoW and the way that WoW plays, because these abilities, specifically empowered abilities, feel strange and feel like they don't fit as well. So that's a few of the downsides then. I don't think there's much else to really mention in terms of downsides. There was the previous Quake where you basically never pressed Pyre unless you were on like 6+ targets, I think. That's been changed now, so I'm happy with where it is, but there's not a downside anymore. The only other things to mention are all upsides. So utility, we've been through the utility, but I'll go through it again quickly. But then the other thing that I really want to mention is the movement of the spec. Again, I think I might have mentioned it at the start, talked around the topic a little bit, but you have you are the class with the most movement in the game now, I would say, as a range spec, other than BM Hunter. So like, I think previously it was BM Hunter, then it was like Boomkin, then there was a few other specs that could do mostly damage on the move, right? But I think now you're right up there. So basically the way the hover works, you get 2 charges of it. You can then press it. If you don't press a direction ability, you just hop into the air and then you can cast on the move, right? So there's a lot of casting on the move that you can do. And then if you're holding a direction and you press it, it's also a leap, so you can cover a lot of ground. The other thing that you can do, even if you're in combat, so watch, I'll press an ability here, and if you just spam jump, you can just like travel at like 50% movement speed through your jump all the time. Like, it's really, really fast. Double jumping. It's like Demon Hunter, but just on steroids. It's super fast. So you are an incredibly, incredibly fast class in trying to cover distance, even without pressing your movement abilities. You then also have another movement ability in Zephyr, which is a group-wide movement speed increase. You have Verdant Embrace, so you can just jump to an ally, right? And then you have Rescue. I can't show you because I'm not in a group with anyone, but if I had this person targeted, I would jump to them and then I could jump over here and take them with me. That's a niche ability that's very, very strong. It's picking up something like a Shadow Priest and running them out of a mechanic. It's going to feel clutch. It's a bit like the Priest Leap of Faith ability, right? But you actually get to move the person to a new location. You don't have to be in a specific location. So again, lots and lots of movement in here. It does feel like it's a very mobile class, which is great, especially considering its range. That's going to help a lot. The other wins to mention then are all in utility. I've just said it's wins. They're not really wins because I'm not doing big wins and big losses. But the other things to mention around the positives in the spec, it's all around utility, right? So I did quickly go through it at the start, but we'll go through it again. This is probably one of the biggest ones. Cauterizing Flame. Cauterize an ally's wounds, removing all bleed, poison, curse, and disease effects, and it's on a 1-minute cooldown. That's awesome. It's a little bit of a heal, and then you're just removing pretty much anything that you want to, other than magic effects. So that's anything that's not a magic effect, but obviously magic effects can be done by your healer anyway, so it's good. It's very niche. It's a bit like the dwarf racial, but you can cast it on others. Rescue, we just been through. I'm not going to mention it again, but a bit like Leap of Faith, but better, I would have said. Pressing Roar, this is really interesting. Let out a bone-shaking roar at enemies in a cone in front of you, increasing the duration of crowd controls that affects them by 50% for the next 10 seconds. So if I just go and show you this here, you see how it's got this on it, and then if I use Deep Breath, it's on DRs, but Deep Breath would last 4.5 seconds instead of 3 seconds from the stun, so this point down here means that it would do 4.5 seconds now. You can also take Overroar. Pressing Roar moves 1 enrage effect from each enemy, and its cooldown is reduced by 20 seconds. Each enrage is spelled. Raging Weeks, that's going to be absolutely insane. You have an AoE Soothe. Very, very good. The things to mention then, so Zephyr over here, we've spoke around it a little bit, but it's a damage reduction for the group, right? So everyone is taking 20% reduced damage from area of effect attacks, which is but you really want it. And then you also get increased movement speed. So you see I was giving everyone 30% movement speed as well. Very nice. The only other things are just, so Time Spiral and Blessing of the Bronze in terms of like group-wide utility, right? Blessing of the Bronze, weave the threads of time, reducing the cooldown of a major ability for all party and raid members by 50% for 1 hour. It's just movement, so it's things like, I think it's Blink for Mage. We've been talking a lot about Mage, so I'll just keep it on track, but I think it's Blink, for example, right? You could then take Time Spiral, which means it resets it, essentially, so you get 2 uses of Blink for free whenever that ability is pressed. So again, big movement phases in raids, Jailer constantly moving. You could press this in one of those big moves in, was it P3? Can't really remember. Maybe it was P4 where you're trying to like run away from stuff constantly. It's going to be very useful there, right? Very, very useful. So overall though, like I said, it feels very good. I don't think it's quite at mage level. It's not as tanky. It brings more utility, and in terms of damage, it's got a very similar damage profile. Very, very strong AoE, but I don't think it's quite at the level in terms of power. It's just not quite there. It's in just the level beneath with things like Affliction Warlock, BM Hunter, etc., etc. It's right up there. I just don't know if it's going to be the top of the ranged meta. It would be really hard to dethrone Fire Mage, or Mage in particular, but it absolutely could. I'd just be surprised if it does. Just before we sign out then, if you've had any additional questions or anything, you can feel free to drop a comment. I always try and respond to people's comments on my YouTube videos. You can also join my Discord in the description down below. Again, there's lots of good conversation going on there. You can ask me absolutely anything that you want. Any questions I will always try and answer and be as helpful as I possibly can. Otherwise, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you have, we'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.